beer in England has been brewed for hundreds of years. As a beer brewing country, England is known for its top fermented cask beer, which finishes maturing in the cellar of the pub rather than at the brewery and is served with only natural carbonation. English beer styles include bitter, mild, brown ale and old ale. Stout, porter and India Pale Ale were also originally brewed in London. Lager-style beer has increased considerably in popularity since the mid-20th century. Other modern developments include consolidation of large brewers into multinational corporations, growth of beer consumerism, expansion of microbreweries and increased interest in bottle-conditioned beers. History. Romano-Celtic Britain. Brewing in Britain was probably well established when the Romans arrived in 54 BC and certainly continued under them. In the 1980s, archaeologists found the evidence that Rome's soldiers in Britain sustained themselves on Celtic ale. A series of domestic and military accounts written on wooden tablets were dug up at the Roman fort of Vindolanda, at Chesterholm in modern Northumbria, dating to between AD 90 and AD 130. They reveal the garrison at Vindolanda buying cerveza, or beer, as the legions doubtless did throughout the rest of Roman Britain, almost certainly from brewers in the local area. Quote, one list of accounts from Vindolanda mentions Atractus the brewer, the first named brewer in British history, as well as the first known professional brewer in Britain. The accounts also show purchases of braces, that is, emmer wheat, doubtless for brewing. Quite possibly the garrison bought the malt, and hired a local brewer to make beer from it for the troops. Quote, in Roman Britain, brewing, both domestic and retail, must have been widespread. Remains indicating the existence of Roman-era malting of brewing operations have been found from Somerset to Northumberland, and South Wales to Colchester. In the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, Roman hypocaust technology for supplying central heating to homes was adapted in Britain to build permanent corn dryers, maltings, and the remains of these double-floored buildings, with underground flues, are found in Roman towns as well as on Roman farms. British brewing is generally thought to have been part of a wider Celtic tradition, since this was well before the introduction of hops. Other flavourings such as honey, meadowsweet and mugwort may have been used. Middle Ages. Alewands, alewives and aleconers. Beer was one of the most common drinks during the Middle Ages. It was consumed daily by all social classes in the northern and eastern parts of Europe, where grape cultivation was difficult or impossible. Beer provided a considerable amount of the daily calories in the northern regions. In England, the per capita consumption was 275 to 300 litres a year by the late Middle Ages, and beer was drunk with every meal. In the Middle Ages, ale would have been brewed on the premises from which it was sold. Alewives would put out an ale wand to show when the beer was ready. The medieval authorities were more interested in ensuring adequate quality and strength of the beer than discouraging drinking. Gradually men became involved in brewing and organized themselves into guilds such as the Brewers' Guild in London of 1342 and the Edinburgh Society of Brewers in 1598. As brewing became more organized and reliable, many inns and taverns ceased brewing for themselves and bought beer from these early commercial breweries. An ale-conner, sometimes aleconner, was an officer appointed yearly at the court elite of ancient English communities to ensure the goodness and wholesomeness of bread, ale, and beer. There were many different names for this position, which varied from place to place. Ale tasters, gustatores servicii, ale founders, and ale-conners. Ale-conners were often trusted to ensure that the beer was sold at a fair price. Historically, 4 ale-conners were chosen annually by the Common Hall of the city. It is sometimes said that the ale-conner was a type of early tacksman whose job it was to test the quality and strength of beer, not by quaffing, but by sitting in a puddle of it. They traveled from pub to pub clad in sturdy leather breech. Beer was poured on a wooden bench and the connoisseurs sat in it. Depending on how sticky they felt it to be when they stood up, they were able to assess its alcoholic strength and impose the appropriate duty. However, the accuracy of the colorful legend is doubtful. 1400 to 1699. Rise of hopped beer. The use of hops in beer was written of as early as 822 by Carolingian abbot. Flavoring beer with hops was known at least since the 9th century, but was only gradually adopted because of difficulties in establishing the right proportions of ingredients. Before that, brewed, a mix of various herbs, had been used, but did not have the same conserving properties as hops. In the book of Margery Kemp, Margery dictates her story to a scribe, and reports that in the early 15th century she attempted to brew beer in Bishop's Lynn, Norfolk, and makes other references to bottles of beer. In the 15th century, an unhopped beer would have been known as an ale, while the use of hops would make it a beer. Hopped beer was imported to England from the Netherlands as early as 1400 in Winchester, and hops were being planted on the island by 1428. At the time, ale and beer brewing were carried out separately, no brewer being allowed to produce both. The Brewers' Company of London stated, "No hops, herbs, or other like thing be put into any ale or liquor whereof ale shall be made, but only liquor, malt, and yeast." Quote. This comment is sometimes misquoted as a prohibition on hopped beer. However, hopped beer was opposed by some, e.g., ale is made of malta and water, and they the which do put any other things to ale than is rehearsed, except yes balmy, or godegod, doth sophisticat their ale. Ale for an English hayman is a natural drinker. Ale must have these properties: it must be fresh and clear, it must not be ropey, nor smoky, nor it must have no weft nor tail. Ale shall not be drunk evender. There's oldie, ... Barley malta maketh better ale than oaten malta or any other corn doth, ... Beer is made of malta, of hops, and water. It is a natural drink for a Dutchman. And Norway of late days it is much avsed in England to the detriment of many English haymen, for the drink is a cold drink, yet it doth make man fat, and doth inflate the belly, as it doth apper by the Dutchmen faces and bellies. A survey in 1577 of drinking establishment in England and Wales for taxation purposes recorded 14,202 alehouses, 1,631 inns, and 329 taverns, representing one pub for every 187 people. 1700 to 1899. Industry and empire. The early 18th century saw the development of a popular new style of dark beer in London, porter. Before 1700, London brewers sent out the beer very young, and any aging was either performed by the publican or a dealer. Porter was the first beer to be aged at the brewery and dispatched in a condition fit to be drunk immediately. It was the first beer that could be made on any large scale, and the London porter brewers, such as Whitbread, Truman, Parsons and Thrale, achieved great success financially. The large London porter breweries pioneered many technological advances, such as the construction of large storage vats, the use of the thermometer, the hydrometer, and temperators. The 18th century also saw the development of India Pale Ale. Among the earliest known named brewers whose beers were exported to India was George Hodgson of the Bowbury. The late 18th century saw a system of progressive taxation based on the strength of beer in terms of cost of ingredients, leading to three distinct gradations: table, small, and strong beer. Mixing these types was used as a way of achieving variation, and sometimes avoiding taxation, and remained popular for more than a century afterwards. The beer engine, a device for manually pumping beer from a container in a pub's basement to cellar, was invented by Joseph Bramah in 1797. The bar-mounted pump handle, with its changeable pump clip indicating the beer on offer, remains a familiar and characteristic sight in most English pubs. Before the beer engine, beer was generally poured into jugs in the cellar or taproom and carried into the serving area. The Beer House Act 1830 enabled anyone to brew and sell beer, ale or cider, whether from a public house or their own homes, upon obtaining a moderately priced license of just under 2 liras for beer and ale and 1 lira for cider, without recourse to obtaining them from justices of the peace, as was previously required. The result was the opening of hundreds of new pubs throughout England, and the reduction of the influence of the large breweries. One of the motivations of the Act was to reduce the abusive overconsumption of gin. Demand for the export style of pale ale, which had become known as India Pale Ale, developed in England around 1840, and India Pale Ale became a popular product in England. Some brewers dropped the term India in the late 19th century, but records indicated that these pale ales retained the features of earlier IPA. A pale and well-hopped style of beer was developed in Burton-on-Trent in parallel with the development of India Pale Ale elsewhere. Previously, Englishmen had drunk mainly stout and porter, but bitter came to predominate. Beers from Burton were considered of a particularly high quality due to synergy between the malt and hops in use and local water chemistry, especially the presence of gypsum. This extensively hopped, lighter beer was easier to store and transport, and so favored the growth of larger breweries. The switch from pewter tankards to glassware also led drinkers to prefer lighter beers. The development of rail links to Liverpool enabled brewers to export their beer throughout the British Empire. Burton retained absolute dominance in pale ale brewing. At its height, 1/4 of all beer sold in Britain was produced there until a chemist, C.W. Vincent, discovered the process of Burtonization to reproduce the chemical composition of the water from Burton-upon-Trent, thus giving any brewer the capability to brew pale ale. In the 19th century, a typical brewery produced 3 or 4 mild ales, usually designated by a number of X's, the weakest being X, the strongest XXXX. They were considerably stronger than the milds of today, with the gravity ranging from around 1.055 to 1.072. Gravities dropped throughout the late 19th century, and by 1914 the weakest milds were down to about 1.045. Still considerably stronger than modern versions. Continental lagers began to be offered in pubs in the late 19th century, but remained a small part of the market for many decades. 1900 to 1949. Temperance and war. The temperance movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in combination with First World War emergency measures, introduced a number of changes, such as higher taxation on beer, lower strengths, a ban on buying around, and restricted opening hours. Most were gradually repealed over subsequent decades. The First World War measures had a particularly dramatic effect upon mild ale. As the biggest selling beer, it suffered the largest cut in gravity when breweries had to limit the average OG of the beer to 1.030. In order to be able to produce some stronger beer, which was exempt from price controls and thus more profitable, mild was reduced to 1.025 or lower. Less strict restrictions were applied in Ireland, allowing Irish brewers such as Guinness to continue to brew beers closer to pre-war strengths. English breweries continued to brew a range of bottled, and sometimes draft, stouts until the Second World War and beyond. They were considerably weaker than the pre-war versions and around the strength that porter had been in 1914. The drinking of porter, with its strength slot now occupied by single stout, steadily declined, and production ceased in the early 1950s. However, Irish brewed stouts, particularly Guinness, remained firmly popular. In the early 20th century, serving draft beer from pressurized containers began. Artificial carbonation was introduced in the United Kingdom in 1936, with Watney's experimental pasteurized beer Red Barrel, although this method of serving beer did not take hold in the UK until the late 1960s. 1950 to 1999, mega breweries and microbreweries. In 1960, almost 40% of beer drunk nationally was sold in bottled form, although the figure was 60% in the south of England, falling to 20% in the north of England. Pale ale had replaced mild as the beer of choice for the majority of drinkers. Home brewing without a license was legalized in 1963 and was to become a fairly popular hobby, with home brewing equipment shops on many high streets. Lager rapidly rose in popularity from the 1970s, increasing from only 2% of the market in 1965 to 20% in 1975, with English brewers producing their own brands of brewing under license. Canned beer was also introduced about this time. A consumer organization, the Campaign for Real Ale, was founded in 1971 to protect unpressurized beer. The group devised the term real ale to differentiate between beer served from the cask and beer served under pressure, and to differentiate both from lager. Ale now meant a top fermented beer, not an unhopped beer. Camera was to become an influential force, with a membership of over 170,000. At the time, brewing was dominated by the Big Six breweries: Whitbread, Scottish Newcastle-based Charrington, Allied Breweries, Courage Imperial, and Watney's. There were also dozens of regional breweries, although the number was dwindling as a result of takeovers, and the microbrewery sector consisted of just 4 long-standing brewpubs. Most pubs were owned by breweries, and only allowed to offer the owning breweries beers. Camera also campaigned against the tendency of smaller brewers to be bought up by larger ones, against short measures, for the preservation of historically significant pubs, and for increased choice and longer opening hours for pubs. Camera also produced a good beer guide and campaigned for the preservation of mild ale, which was now seen as an endangered style. English drinkers became more interested in imported beers during the 1970s and 1980s, partly as a result of increased foreign travel, and partly because of promotion of the subject by beer writers such as Michael Jackson, with his 1977 The World Guide to Beer. Newly popular foreign brands included Beck's from Germany, Heineken and Grolsch from the Netherlands, Leffe and Hoegaarden from Belgium, Peroni from Italy, San Miguel from the Philippines, Budweiser and Sierra Nevada from the US, and Corona Extra from Mexico. A number of bars specialize in imported beer, with food and decor to match, Belgian and Bavarian themes being the most common. In 1979, Tim Martin opened the first Wetherspoon's first pub in Muswell Hill, North London. This was the basis of a national chain of pubs, which were to prove influential on the English beer scene, because of the low prices, large premises, and championing of cask ale. Also in 1979, David Bruce established the first Firkin brewpub. The Firkin chain consisted of pubs offering cask ale brewed on the premises, or at another brewpub in the chain. The chain expanded to over 100 pubs over its 20-year history, considerably adding to the number of brewpubs in England. After a number of changes of ownership, brewing operations were wound up in 2001. 2 pieces of legislation, known as the Beer Orders, were introduced in December 1989, partly in response to Camera campaigning. The orders restricted the number of tied pubs that could be owned by large brewery groups in the United Kingdom to 2,000, and required large brewer landlords to allow guest ale to be sourced by tenants from someone other than the landlord. The industry responded by spinning off purely pub-owning companies, such as punch taverns and enterprise inns. For the older brewing and owning companies, notably Allied Lions Space and Scottish Namp Newcastle, the beer orders were revoked in January 2003, by which time the industry had been transformed. 2000 to present Hops and Hipsters. A change to beer taxation. Progressive beer duty was introduced by Gordon Brown in 2002. It was a reduction in beer duty based on a brewery's total production and aimed at helping smaller breweries. The legislation had been campaigned for by the Society of Independent Brewers. In 2009, the combined sales of SUDOC's 420-plus members increased by 4% compared with 2008. By 2011, the breweries in the UK were recording an average growth in beer sales of 3% to 7% per annum. By 2004, the term real ale had been expanded to include bottle-conditioned beer, while the term cask ale had become the accepted global term to indicate a beer not served under pressure. Interest in imported beer continued to rise, with an influx of Eastern European workers making Lech and Tyskie particularly popular, alongside Stara Pramin, Budvar and Kozel. A piece of legislation popularly known as the 24-Hour Drinking, officially the Licensing Act 2003 Act, came into force in 2005. This removed the previous national restrictions on opening hours, allowing pubs and licensed premises to open for any or all of a 24-hour period, subject to agreement with the local licensing authorities. In practice, most pubs made only minor changes to their opening hours. Although its founding father, Michael Jackson, died in 2007, modern British beer writing was burgeoning, with beer columns appearing alongside wine columns in the quality press. Beer writing was to evolve into beer blogging. Leaders in both fields, including Martin Cornell, Pete Brown, Roger Protz and Melissa Cole. In July 2007, a law was introduced to forbid smoking in all enclosed public places in England, including pubs. The popularity of lager fell from 74.5% in 2008 to 74.3%, and the Observer publication suggested that British beer drinkers' love affair with carbonated beers may finally have peaked. The 2010 edition of the Good Beer Guide showed that there were more than 700 real ale brewers in the UK at the time of publication, the highest number since the Second World War and 4 times as many since the founding of CAMRA. Ian Lowe, a spokesman for CAMRA, explained a preference for moderate alcohol levels and a perception that real ale was healthier as responsible for the shift. Since the 2010s, there has been what some media outlets describe as an explosion of interest in craft beer. Although the term craft beer does not have formal definition in the UK, it is generally taken to mean beer from small breweries which is highly flavorful and distinctive, particularly hop-forward beers, delivered in bottles of the key keg draft formats, ideas mainly deriving from the US microbrewery scene. Craft beer may stand alongside other beers in a mainstream pub, or be retailed in specialist outlets, such as the chain owned by Scottish brewers BrewDog. Craft beers are often stronger than standard ales and lagers, and may be sold in 1/3 pint and 2/3 towards pint measures in addition to the usual pints and halves. A number of commentators have noted that craft beer appeals to a younger clientele, particularly those characterized as hipsters. A number of breweries associated with the craft movement have been taken over by multinationals, prompting debate about whether they should still be considered craft. Although the choice available to English beer drinkers in the mid-2010s is perhaps unparalleled, there are concerns about the future of pubs, with about 30 closing per week. Backing the trend somewhat are craft beer outlets, the Wetherspoons chain, and the micro-pub movement. The Wetherspoons chain has expanded to nearly 1,000 outlets over its 25-year history, most of them being former shops, banks and so on, rather than traditional pub premises. Describing themselves as free houses, its branches offer a wider range of cask ales than other pubcos, and they have recently begun offering craft beer. Micro-pubs are small community pubs with limited opening hours, and focusing strongly on local cask ale. With cask ale having a secure future, the campaign for real ale has been reconsidering its aims, with the options including focusing on the preservation of pubs,